Episode 106, and it's October the 17th, 1923. Bournemouth 6BM goes on the air, the final of the early BBC stations. So previously on the British Broadcasting Century. In May 1922, the Postmaster General said in the House of Commons that a limited number of wireless stations would be licensed, and that number was 8.
14th November 1922.
2LO, Marconi House, London, calling.
2ZY at the Trafford Park, Manchester, the next day.
We had to delay our opening by one day because we only got the news late in the afternoon. The only way of getting the news bulletins in those days was to have them telephoned up from London, taken down in shorthand, typed, and then read by myself or somebody. That's why we are the 15th as against 14th for 2LO.
5IT at the General Electric Company's works, Whitton, Birmingham.
Hello, this is 5IT.
And then on Christmas Eve, 5NO Newcastle.
I did the announcing from the very first. Mr. Thomas wouldn't stand for more than an hour broadcasting in the evening at first. I said, but we'll have to have more, Mr. Thomas. He said, no, I can't get my transmitter. It'll have to be got ready. And he wouldn't do more than an hour. I wasn't allowed to order him. I was BBC. He was Marconi.
The following spring, 5WA Cardiff.
What a wonderful thing, to be the first to broadcast in Wales. I mean, it was quite an honour for me, and naturally they wanted me to sing something in Welsh, so I remember the first thing I sang was David the Garrigwen.
And 5SC Glasgow.
I had a little experimental studio in Bath Street in Glasgow, in a flat. It was really a comical setup with cables from the kitchen to the dining room in the little flat, and a microphone like a soup plate suspended from the ceiling.
And on our previous episode, 2BD Aberdeen joined on the 10th of October 1923.
Stand with me for a moment and look out over just a section of its northern and eastern districts.
To my knowledge, that's the first time those pioneer voices have been heard together, all either the first or very nearly the first to broadcast from each of the first 7 BBC stations, united at last. That's Arthur Burrows, Kenneth Wright, A.E. Thompson, Tom Payne, Mostyn Thomas, Kathleen Garscadden and R.E. Jeffrey, introduced by Lord Areath. 1 week after the 7th of those stations, Aberdeen, the BBC's 8th and final of the first batch launched on England's south coast. 6BM Bournemouth, the subject of this episode. On the 17th of October 1923 that launched. Oh look, when this podcast landed, the 17th of October 2025, on its 102nd birthday. Then we will piece together what we can of Bournemouth's opening night. Its early days, its later days. And for so much of this episode, we really have to thank Seán Street, Emeritus Professor of Radio at Bournemouth University, and you will hear some beautiful extracts, used with Seán's permission, from his 1973 documentary 6BM Calling.
Hello children, this is Auntie Lulu speaking from 6BM. But first of all, I want to speak to Janet Spreadbury. And will you go and look under the cushion in Mother's own special chair? I think you'll find a little parcel there, something that you've been longing for a long time.
Now, we'll just do tiny snippets here. So I urge you to Google 6BM Calling Seán Street, and you will find a half-hour documentary made 52 years ago that does so much better what we're seeking to do here. Hints of it to come. And since this episode marks the end of the beginning of the first 8 stations of the Beeb, we'll look ahead to the 21st century broadcasting world and what is next for it, with radio futurologist, media consultant, editor of Pod News, James Cridland.
The smartphone's the most interactive device you have. It's always within arm's reach. You can always change what's on. And then, of course, you've got live radio where somebody else is playing the songs for you. And you don't even have a fast forward button. Younger audiences are expecting much more on-demand access, much more interactivity. And that's why much, much more of that audio consumption is things like Spotify, Apple Music and podcasts.
Plus another clue about our Christmas audio gift and some of the voices of those who were there at the start of Bournemouth 6BM, launching on 17th of October 1923 and celebrated here in the present day on the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is
Bournemouth
calling.
Hello, Paul Carenza here. Thank you for joining us. Episode 106 is ahead of us with a marvellous guest in James Cridland, radio futurologist, editor of Pod News, and he has a daily podcast newsletter I thoroughly recommend. james.cridland.net is his website if you would like to sign up for that. And I just know you're going to enjoy our chat that we had here for the podcast. In fact, we chatted for so long, we may spread this out over several episodes. Because although this is the end of the beginning of the early BBC story, we're celebrating the launch of Bournemouth 6BM, 17th of October 1923. Oh, but there's so much more to tell you of the early British broadcasting story. So that's what we're here for, your moment-by-moment guide to what happened when, and looking at those echoes from the very early days and how it affects our listening and indeed viewing today. Before we get going, thank you to all of you who have filled in our survey, our very first podcast survey. It's not too late to do so if you haven't already. tiny.cc, that's tiny.cc/BB Century Survey. If you can't catch all that, the link's in the show notes. One of our survey responses, and I should say they're all anonymous, I can't tell who wrote what. So far, people have said rather nice things, but you could be the first to be unpleasant if you really want to. But one person's response mentioned that it was really useful to know what's coming up on the podcast as well, to give it a bit of overall context. You know, we start each episode with previously on the podcast, which again, I'll gladly drop if you don't enjoy that. But I think it lets you know a little bit of where we are, where we've come from. But also quite nice to see a little bit of where we're going in the early British broadcasting story. We can zoom in a little bit too much sometimes, so were we to zoom out a little, I could tell you that although this episode, we're in October 1923, the launch of that 8th and final of the much-promised early BBC stations, there is a 9th they then added, which is Belfast. That was yet to come as well. 2BE, that followed in 1924. And then the relay stations come along as well, starting with Sheffield and then filling the sort of gaps in the land using the trunk line, the simultaneous broadcasting idea to make sure that actually more and more people could hear whatever was being broadcast across the country. So all of that comes in from then. November 1923, we'll do some episodes about the armistice. That was the big question. Would they broadcast the Great Silence, as it was called? How do you broadcast silence on the radio? And how that sculpts the mould for how we broadcast the armistice still to this very day, 100 years later. Elsewhere, in November 1923, it was the BBC's birthday, 14th November, so they had a little bit of a do for that. So we'll have a bit of a do for that on the podcast as well, including, for the first time probably ever, you'll hear from Arthur Burrows' grandson. It took a long time to track him down. He's now in South Africa, and I had a lovely chat with him and Arthur Burrows' great-granddaughter. So we'll hear from them on that episode. Then late November 1923, they had transatlantic broadcasts. So we'll talk about that. We'll also have some early dramatists, Gertrude Jennings, Kathleen Baker, the Savoy Orpheans, the band. We'll talk about the first Muslim broadcaster, the first Jewish broadcaster, both on the air late 1923. All that coming up and plenty more besides on the podcast. Later this episode, we're back in October of 1923. The 8th station, Bournemouth 6BM, is coming up. And the voices of those who were there brought to us thanks to the wonderful documentary 6BM Calling from Professor Seán Street. Link in the show notes to the full documentary from 1973. We'll play you a few excerpts this episode. But before we go back, let's look ahead with radio futurologist James Cridland. Writer, consultant, advisor about radio futurologist. We'll talk about his backstory in terms of radio, streaming, BBC, and his own Pod News, of which he's an editor, daily newsletter on podcasting. James Cridland, thank you for joining us, James.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
I'm curious to know, how are you listening to audio and radio? Are you a digital internet? I'm guessing not long wave.
Well, not long wave because I live in Australia, so therefore long wave is not a thing here. But how do I listen to audio? When I'm listening on the radio, I'm mostly listening to DAB or through a smart speaker. Listen to DAB in the car. But I try and listen to AM now and again. That's really the only thing in some of the more remote parts of Australia, and just sort of a variety of different things. A multi-platform consumption pattern, I guess, is the thing.
I suppose you have to, in terms of getting a glimpse of it all, but you have a global sense of radio and audio and all of these things. Even the word radio seems to be changing. But I guess we all want to know, does the BBC have a future? Is there hope?
Oh, I think there's definitely hope. I think the question is, how will the BBC be funded? So therefore, that is its existential problem right now. Is the licence fee the right plan moving forward? Is there something else? And particularly, what does that mean outside of the UK, which is a very different world to inside of the UK? So I suppose from that point of view, we need to work out what the financial future of the BBC is. But everybody who I have ever spoken to says that the BBC should not go away. It's a wonderful place. It's a wonderful thing to exist, and that we should make sure that we keep it. But on the other hand, the licence fee isn't necessarily the right way in the future. So I think we've got that sort of, double-edged sword there, that sort of, complication of, we all recognise that it's a brilliant thing, but how do we keep it going?
Yeah, I guess it seems like the licence fee, we are sort of, we've inherited it and we're sort of stuck with it. And until something better as a plan comes along, but it does seem to be all the solutions so far don't seem to be necessarily either better or easier, and may risk losing a sense of the fact that the BBC public service broadcasting can be for everybody, I suppose, if you start limiting audience. That seems to change what the original purpose of it was and is.
Yes, I mean, it clearly can't be something which is a subscription service that you have to pay money for if you want it, and if you don't want it, then that's fine. That clearly won't work. Nor, frankly, will it work if you're asking for advertising, because firstly, you'll bankrupt most of the other media organisations that exist anyway. And secondly, well, how's that going to benefit anybody really? Particularly when you have a look at the comparative budgets for BBC Radio to commercial radio. There's a massive difference there. So I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. I mean, my own personal view is that a government grant works the best, where you earmark and legally earmark somehow an amount of money from the public purse that pays for the BBC. It works here in Australia. It works in various other parts of the world. So perhaps that is a way forward, or some form of means-tested taxation. So if you earn enough money, then you're taxed, and you're taxed more money depending on how rich you are. That's the system in, I think, Finland. That's another way forward. But certainly, I think anything that is going to take away from commercial broadcasters is going to be a bad plan. So, all of that needs to be worked out. But of course, what we're currently seeing is we're seeing a lot of doom mongering from the BBC, because they want to make it really clear that they still need money, and they need money to produce a good sounding and a good looking output. So we will see some work on both sides, I suppose.
Much more from James Cridland to come this episode. And on that note of how to fund the BBC today, well, it's the perfect moment to leap back to the 16th of October 1923, 6 days after our previous episode where 2BD Aberdeen launched, and 1 day before 6BM Bournemouth launched. The Daily Mirror reported a new technique the BBC had of sourcing revenue.
Are you a pirate? From today on, there will apparently be a pursuit of unlicensed listeners, of pirate broadcasters, of wireless irregulars who haven't got their sets in the authorised manner. The number of free sets vastly exceeds the number of accorded licences. Perhaps the pirates will lie low and listen not at all for a month or two, until the licensers have grown weary of trying to intercept and discriminate between waves of invisible sound. Anyhow, it's a new problem for applied science.
Yes, a pursuit of unlicensed listeners. So the next day after that article, it's the 17th of October 1923, and it's time to launch their 8th station. Now, I notice something I've not really seen reported anywhere in a history book, but maybe I'm reading too much into this. 17th of October 23, that's exactly 1 day off, precisely 1 year since the BBC first became a company. 18th of October 1922 is when the BBC agreement came in. And just shy of 1 year, by 1 day, they launched that 8th station that they promised to originally do. I've not seen it written they had to do it in under a year, but it's rather appropriate. They managed all 8 stations, just hours under a year. So this was Bournemouth then. It was for a while going to be Plymouth, but they moved it for technical reasons. So for some months now, Bournemouth has been the plan. Although actually Bournemouth's link with broadcasting arguably predates the BBC by a whole generation, before Marconi even sent his first wireless pip. You might recall the electrophone we talked about, a dozen or so episodes ago. Dr. Tasha Kitcher joined us to talk all about it. It was a Victorian live streaming device, connects with your landline. It landed in Paris and London and Bournemouth. No idea why Bournemouth, but there you go. They were listening to theatrical performances via their landlines. In the 1890s, a full quarter century before wireless broadcasting was even an idea. And of course, within a few years of the electrophone, Marconi himself was very near that patch, sending messages to and from the Isle of Wight to test out his new wireless experimentation. So now, 2 or 3 decades later, the children of those Bournemouth residents had at last a local radio station of their own, coming along just as local broadcasting was starting to be edged out by some sort of national service via simultaneous broadcasting. Popular Wireless, 13th of October 1923.
It is confidently asserted by the engineers in charge of the plant that Bournemouth will be the most efficient of all BBC stations, and in view of the inevitable jamming from ships and coast stations that must be expected, this is very fortunate. It's anticipated that Bournemouth will provide a wonderful selection of items whose popularity is already assured, owing to the fact that they will be chosen from the rest's best and will take advantage of months of experience gained elsewhere.
6BM Bournemouth's studio was at 72 Holdenhurst Road, above a pram and cycle shop. Now, bear in mind, in those days, a cycle shop was also a place you could go and collect your charged batteries to power your wireless set. Like other early BBC stations, the transmitter was nearby but elsewhere. In this case, that was next to the North Cemetery. And its station director was the ever-popular Bertram Fryer, who had come down from Newcastle 5-0. His audience there missed him so much that, I'll let Cecil Lewis tell you. That first Deputy Director of Programmes, in his 1924 book that we're reading on Patreon, bit by bit, Broadcasting from Within.
Newcastle listeners say they can still hear his voice and cheerful manner just as clearly from Bournemouth as they could when he was in Newcastle. They feel that in this way they can still keep in touch with him, and I believe his departure from Newcastle sent the sale of valve sets sky high. Because so many people regretted his going, they added valves to their sets so as not to lose him. If this is the case, we shall have to move all the station directors about the country periodically to increase the sale of expensive apparatus.
Someone who has researched 6BM Bournemouth's origins more than pretty much anyone on the planet is the Emeritus Professor of Radio at Bournemouth University, Seán Street. And a marvellous article we will link to in the show notes, or you can Google the name Seán Street and the phrase "the scent of the pines" to read more fully about 6BM Bournemouth's origins. Why the title, The Scent of the Pines? Well, the station's opening words were
6BM Bournemouth sends hearty greetings to the world. We do hope you can smell the pines.
Because Bournemouth is known for its pine trees. Not by me, I will add. I had no idea. I thought Hill Valley was known for its pine trees. Anyway, Sean's article includes quotes of interviews that he did with some of the station's original staff back in 1973 for a radio programme for its half-centenary. I won't quote them in full here. They are his, but you can check out the link to his article to read it, or indeed check out a link in the show notes to listen to that 1973 programme, where you can hear, for example, 6BM's engineer, R.G. Tiny Durham.
You sit around this little box chained to it, with all wearing headphones, and everybody with various expressions on their faces according to what the programme was, and quite amusing to suddenly find they were all bursting out laughing for no apparent reason.
Read the article for more and hear extracts on soundcloud.com/Sean's-wireless/6BM-calling, or you can find that link in our show notes. You'll love it. It's gorgeous. 17th of October 1923, the Nottingham Evening News reported,
Bournemouth, power 1,500 watts, wavelength 385 metres, call signal 6BM. 8 o'clock, the Bournemouth Municipal Military Band, the Oriana Singers, speech by the Mayor of Bournemouth, introduced by Mr. J.C.W. Reith, General Manager of the BBC, Bournemouth Wireless Orchestra. 9 o'clock, speech by Lord Burnham, introduced by Lord Gainford, Chairman of the BBC.
And I hear Lord Gainford said,
We realise that with the establishment of the 8th and last station in the original agreement, we are not at an end, but only at the beginning of our labours. It is quite impossible to forecast the future of broadcasting, but all are agreed that it has unlimited possibilities. The standard of the Bournemouth programmes will have to be high.
Yeah, all right, your lordship. They've only been on air an hour. Most of it's been you. And he introduced Lord Burnham, who had been on the Sykes Committee, where he'd heard concerned voices from the press, worried the BBC was infringing on their turf. So Lord Burnham told the Bournemouth listeners,
"The newspapers had nothing to fear from broadcasting of news. On the contrary, insofar as it increased public curiosity and stimulated public interest, it rendered splendid service to the community."
Yes, we'll see. I'm sure the press will forgive and forget very quickly. So the launch night was picked up as far away as Scotland, on naval destroyer HMS Spencer, docked at Queensferry. That was a memory preserved thanks to Professor Seán Street's interviews 52 years ago.
On the 17th of October 1923, we tuned in 6BM and reception was very good. When I came on Christmas leave in December 23, I bought a crystal receiver from my parents and fixed up aerial and earth. I still have this set, and believe it or not, it still works.
Concerts from Bournemouth for the first time yesterday.
The London Daily News, 18th of October.
Bournemouth's wireless station, the 8th of the stations of the British Broadcasting Company, was opened last night. The studio is in Holdenhurst Road and measures 40 feet by 20 feet, being the largest of the provincial studios. Ballater in Aberdeenshire, 600 miles from Bournemouth, reports hearing the items of last night's programme with great clearness.
Did we at some point stop saying clearness and start saying clarity? It isn't clear. There's much unclearness on that fact. In the first 3 days, 2,500 letters of congratulation came to the Bournemouth station, and before long, listeners on the continent were picking it up, loving the Bournemouth content so much there were voluntary offers to pay a licence fee from abroad. Courtesy of our newspaper detective Andrew Barker, the Swanage Times reported on the 19th of January 1924,
"Writing from Nice, one says, 'I'm rarely able to leave my rooms. Your splendid service has made life worth living. We get your broadcasting much clearer than we do Paris, Eiffel Tower. I think your concerts are worthy of all praise.' And a listener who writes from Latreus in the Var region says that technically he feels rather like a pirate, and then asks if it would be in order for him to send 15 shillings, the equivalent of an experimenter's licence in Great Britain. He listens in every evening and thanks the Bournemouth station for the excellence of its programmes. In our opinion, it beats all the other neighbouring countries, and if possible I would like to pay my quota for the many pleasant hours you give us. For clearness of tone, Bournemouth wins by many lengths."
You may have to imagine that in a French accent after the previous episode. I thought I'd leave the accents this time. Yeah. We'll look a little more at Bournemouth's legacy and some of its later broadcasts after we hear more from this episode's guest, from broadcasting past to broadcasting future, with radio futurologist James Cridland. But he's also a man of broadcasting present and indeed recent past. So I asked James about his involvement in changing how we listen today.
2005, I was working at the original Virgin Radio at the time, and we launched the first mobile phone app for a radio station. Virgin was the first radio station to stream online 24 hours a day. I have to be very careful on this. The first European radio station to stream online 24 hours a day.
Okay, yeah.
There may be some prior work there.
Right.
But that came just before my time, I think 1999 at Virgin Radio. It was quite the thing. There was a website that was put together by a fancy online agency, and it was this beautiful map of Golden Square, map of the building with a helicopter on top and various other entertaining things. It was this massive, great big flash file, if you remember that. It took such a long time to download. It was almost impossible, bearing in mind that everybody was still using old screechy modems, 28K8 modems.
Bing, bing, bing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so you'd be there waiting for minutes for the website to finally load. But it was a tremendous piece of work that John Ausby, my predecessor, did to get Virgin Radio streaming online. Virgin ended up being one of the only radio stations that was actually in a preset in all versions of Windows. So you would get Microsoft Windows, you would put the 27 3.5-inch discs into your computer to install the whole thing. And when you'd finally finished, you'd have Windows Media Player, which would have a little radio tab, and it would have, I think, 5 radio stations, and Virgin Radio was one of those. And so we did tremendously well in terms of online streaming. And for a while, us and Jazz FM were the 2 biggest streaming radio stations in the world, which was a tremendous thing.
Wow. I think we take for granted sometimes. We forget that we're in this modern world, but we've all been, many of us, been part of that journey along the way there, and you can think, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember the flashes and the things like that. I saw this clip on YouTube recently. I think it's Pete Tong reading out the first web address on the BBC on Radio 1.
That's right.
and it's
Brilliant,
hilarious.
isn't it?
It lasts about a minute and a half of http dot colon while trying to sound cool at the same time. It's really hilarious. But
oh yeah, no, it's very weird. Yes, I mean, I remember one of the things that I did to Virgin is got rid of the wwws, so you didn't need those anymore, because www reading out on the air is ridiculous. Russ Williams, who was on the air, used to say all the W's, which I always loved.
That's nice. That's nice.
Yeah, but 2005 was when we launched the first mobile phone app. We didn't call it that because there wasn't such a thing as mobile phone apps. And certainly they hadn't been called apps. So we called it the Virgin Radio 3G Tuner. And you could install it on one of 5 Symbian phones if you had the right USB data cable and various other complicated things.
Wow.
None of the phones at the time had Wi-Fi. So you had to use your mobile phone connection, which meant that the audio quality was not the best, shall we say.
Right.
And I remember launching this and lots of people very excited about it. They hadn't quite worked out that it would cost you probably about £12 an hour if you wanted to have a listen. You might as well have gone out and bought a Coldplay CD, to be honest with you, because that's about as far as you would go. But lots of people massively excited. And then I got a scary looking legal fax. Because it was 2005, scary looking legal fax from Virgin.
Oh.
And I thought, what have I done now? And it was from Virgin's second in command. So not Richard Branson, but from the man who was basically doing all of that work. And the basic tenet of this fax was you have the Virgin trademark to run a radio station. You don't have the Virgin trademark to do anything on mobile phones. That's Virgin Mobile.
Oh.
You don't have the Virgin trademark to do anything to do with software. That's Virgin Interactive. And you don't have the Virgin brand name to do anything online. That's virgin.net. What are you doing? And can we have a meeting with you tomorrow?
And don't start an airline. We've got that covered as well. Yeah, okay. Oh gosh.
So that was terrifying. And so he comes in, a man called Will, to the radio station. I tell the CEO of the radio station, and the CEO basically says, "Sort it out, James." So he comes in, and there's me, not very old, not very long in the in the thing. He comes in and he says, "This is dreadful. This is the worst trademark violation that we have ever seen.
Oh,
what are you doing? And how are you going to put it right?" And I said, "You know what? I think in a few years' time, I think every single Virgin company, Virgin Trains, Virgin Energy, Virgin Money, I think every single Virgin company will want one of these mobile app things. And we just happen to be the first. But I think everybody will actually need one of these things." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, all right then, and don't do it again," and walked out. That was the last thing we ever heard of it.
I mean, I don't know if at that stage you identified as a futurologist, but surely this is part of the, once you start sounding more confident about the future than the other people in the room, you win, you win the argument, I guess.
Terrifying.
So this is before you joined the BBC then, at the start of their online audio, which wasn't sounds then, of course, but this is...
Yeah, no, not really. So the BBC started streaming, World Service started streaming in 1998, but the domestic stations followed a little bit later. So there was somebody called Chris Kimber who was looking after quite a lot of that. They had a thing called the BBC Radio Player, which they had launched in about 2000. And their big thing was catch-up radio. So all of a sudden, you could not just listen live to Radio 1 in scratchy real audio 28K quality, but also you could catch up with shows in the past, and that was a big thing. Chris did a tremendous job, and Simon Nelson, who was working with him, did a tremendous job in getting all of that through an organisation that really change is they're not a particular fan of. So that sort of started, and that was really interesting watching what had happened there. They, of course, got into podcasting as well. So by the time I had come to the BBC, I came there in 2007. My first job was realising that the BBC Radio Player, which was still going, was falling apart. Literally, it was every 12 hours or so it would not work, and we would miss particular shows, and we would miss an episode of The Archers. Tell you what, when you missed an episode of The Archers, that's when you knew that things weren't working.
I bet you do. Yeah.
So So my first job literally was pulling the software engineers off other things to fix the radio player, which my understanding had been, it had been basically broken for the previous 6 months. But nobody had actually turned around and said, no, we've got to fix this. This is priority number one. We've got to fix this. So my first job was basically turning up being the very unliked person that was saying, we're going to stop doing this because we need to fix this. And managed to get that fixed relatively fast. But yes, so I ended up starting with that and stayed at the BBC for 2 years, changed a few things in terms of online radio, particularly changed the quality. So moving away from a 32K mono stream, I think in real audio, which did not sound fantastic, to something that was significantly better, rebuilding the entire encoding systems and all of that to actually make it sound just as good, if not better, than DAB. So I was very pleased to end up doing that and very pleased to close down Radio Player and put all of radio into iPlayer Radio, which was such a success they shut it down a couple of years after that. But it was a really interesting time.
More from James Cridland at the end of this episode, and maybe on future episodes too. We had a lot to talk about. Back in the early 20s, Bournemouth 6BM finding its feet. It's launched and it's pretty much the only coastal BBC station, which of course comes with its own culture. So some of the things it broadcast included seaside ballrooms, dance halls, including the legendary Pavilion, and the interviews in the 1970s done by Professor Seán Street included with band leader Fred Bacon, who remembered the pay packet he was given.
Of course, in those days you were not asked to quote terms, but you had to accept what the BBC thought a professional fee. The most unusual amount, £1 6 and threepence. And we were all a little hurt to think that coppers had to be introduced as part of a professional fee. It took hours to realise that the amount represented was 1 1/4 guineas.
Which in modern money is confusing. It wasn't all outside broadcasts, though. Studio music often came from the station pianist, Elsie Franklin. Her dad, Captain Featherstone, was the station's musical director and frequent conductor. Regular singers included Helen Elkington, who told Professor Seán Street about the sign she saw in the studio.
And in the ante room, there was a notice telling people not to refer to listeners in, but to listeners.
6BM's chief announcer was J.H. Raymond, and the children's presenters from the station included the usual aunts and uncles. Here it was Auntie Lulu. She told Professor Seán Street back in 1973 that she was hauled over the coals for mentioning religion.
I sang Christopher Robin, and the next day a station director sent for me and said, "Don't you know you must not mention religion in the children's hour?" Well, I thought Christopher Robin is saying his prayers, but anyhow, I was more careful after that.
Now, I would have thought that John Reith would have preferred that to Christopher Robin is not saying his prayers, but what do I know? Auntie Lulu was also chastised for mentioning alcohol in Children's Hour. What story was she quoting?
Treasure Island. And I thought I'd add a little local colour to it, so the noises off of various things. So I said, "Yo-ho-ho," and a bottle of rum. Next day, on the mat again. "Don't you know you must not mention liquor or drink of any kind in the children's hour?" Oh dear, I wonder I didn't get the push, but I didn't.
And just like 2BD Aberdeen that we mentioned last week, late 1920s saw local stations like Bournemouth shrinking in stature. The BBC became more centralised. London knows best. The national and regional programmes came in, but Bournemouth held its own, relaying concerts from the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra to other stations in the early 1930s, including one where the noted conductor Sir Dan Godfrey, whose son was involved in the BBC in Manchester, he concluded their broadcast concert by telling listeners that he hoped they would come to Bournemouth for their holidays that summer. That was followed by a panicked call from the head of OBs, concerned this was technically an ad and against the BBC's licence agreement. Later into the 1930s, Richard Dimbleby gave his first on-the-spot news report from Bournemouth's radio station. This was a role that he invented, really, by applying to the BBC's news department, saying, "You need out-and-about correspondence, and I'm your man." Now, Dimbleby, of course, was later known for election night specials and wartime reporting, and big tragedies like the Crystal Palace fire, but his first job, interviewing a farmer who had won a milking competition, and interviewing his cow.
In those days I was willing to tackle anything. I wouldn't be so keen on doing it now. The cow was very obliging because we held a microphone up and I said, "What do you think about this wonderful yield of milk you've produced this year?" I don't know whether the farmer gave it a little smack on the back or something, but the extraordinary thing was the cow let out a wonderful moo at this very moment.
And very soon after that, the Bournemouth station closed. Not because of Dimbleby and his cow interview, I'm sure. Just weeks later, World War II began, and the BBC's whole culture and ethos shifted. But we will get to that on a much later podcast episode. Well, thanks to Professor Seán Street, his marvellous article and radio programme on SoundCloud. You can listen, you can read, it's all in the show notes. Have a look. I thoroughly recommend it. And it all helps keep the memory alive of 6BM Bournemouth, which is all we're after on this podcast too. Another way that's been kept alive is via a plaque on the wall of its original site. And that's down to Seán and his colleagues who made that happen too. So that's the first 8 stations launched then. And what of the BBC today and up ahead? Our guest is radio futurologist James Cridland.
When I worked at Virgin Radio, we had a number of other DAB services. And this was back in the very early days of just working out what would we do with DAB. And one of those services was a radio station called Liquid. Just a really interesting, fun story. So that radio station went on the air with some liquid being poured, sound of liquid being poured. I don't think it's ever been actually properly, officially stated that it was our sales director having a wee.
Oh,
no.
no.
It was.
Oh, no.
But what that radio station was is it was, playing new music. But the radio station, I think, did something really clever. Everybody who works at a radio station thinks that they're a radio DJ, right? But there's no way really to give someone that wants to have a go at being a radio DJ a proper job anymore of having a go and seeing if you're a radio jock, because there's no space on the radio, except of course there was on this station. So what they started doing is basically anybody that wanted a show on that station could have one, because let's face it, nobody was listening. And so in the evenings, it was so-and-so who would normally run the mail room, and then it was somebody who worked in our creative department, and then it was somebody else who worked on, making ads and various other things, and they all had their own shows on there. It was the most amazing thing, particularly amazing since our CEO knew nothing about it.
Oh, really?
The first that our CEO knew about it was when we got the first complaint from the radio authority. Or was it Ofcom? It must have been Ofcom, with a complaint of what somebody had heard.
Oh, no. That sounds a bit like how the BBC began, when the director of programmes was also the children's presenter. And we've just been talking about John Reith reading the news and bumping the newsreader out the way so he can take the job, So, yeah.
I always loved my time at the BBC, and occasionally we would meet in what was John Reith's office. And occasionally we would meet in other offices around, and the chief engineering office was always the biggest and the most fancy, and it had all of the beautiful stuff on the walls and everything else. So yes, it was always a fascinating place to work.
Oh, grand indeed. Well, I was doing a show recently when I was talking about how the bit that they said that for the first BBC Christmas they had 4 employees. And only 4 people worked there, and then someone heckled and said, and I think the BBC will end with 4 employees as well. Oh God, let's not think of that just yet. I'm sure there's plenty of time before that yet. Well, thank you so much to think on for the future, and maybe we'll have you back in future as well when there's even there'll be a bit less future to be had, because we'll have had some.
In fact, I can tell you that will happen.
That will happen. Look at this. Well, thank you. And we should, of course, say that your website as well, james.cridland.net, has lots of information about you, and podnews.net, highly recommended podcast newsletter as well. Thank you, James Cridland. Much appreciated. Thank you, James Cridland. He will return with memories of past and present and predictions of future of broadcasting. A quick out and about voice edition before we go, as while we have our own survey on this podcast, the BBC have just published results of their survey. I was one of over 872,000 people who filled in the BBC survey earlier in 2025, and today the results are out. So I thought, mid-edit, since this episode we are looking ahead as well as back, I thought let's have a quick peruse of what these nearly million people said about today's Beeb, and tomorrow's, in fact. I'll put the link in the show notes to the summary if you'd like to see more. 83% of people said the BBC should still inform, educate and entertain. Reithian values alive and well a century on, at least in principle. 9% thought that unimportant, leaving 8% shrugging on the fence. 93% of respondents agreed that the BBC should pursue truth with no agenda.
85% agreed it should back the best homegrown storytelling. Yes, commission us British writers, fewer imports, I say. 75% thought it important to bring people together. I guess the fractured way we enjoy our media nowadays means that's not everyone's priority. Still 3/4 want that. That's interesting. The gaps between what people think it should do and what people think it actually does do. So the biggest gulf, then, of that is 91% of people thought the Beeb should be independent of the government of the day. Only 43% thought the BBC is independent of the government of the day. That's less than half. That is low. I also think the BBC should be independent of the next government, whoever that might be. That's another matter. Another big gap is that 76% thought the BBC should reflect different parts of the UK. Only 51% thought they succeeded in that. Well, the Bournemouth listeners felt reflected 100 years ago. Maybe local radio investment is a good start in terms of local voices on the Beeb, but what do I know? What else then? An asset around the world. 76% thought that was important. 57% thought it delivered on that. Going through the genres, we want more drama, more documentaries. I was frustrated to see comedy and entertainment rolled in together here. That does annoy me a little. Comedy commissions have shrunk lately. Sitcom was replaced with panel shows and celebrity road trips and the like. And you can't even back comedy on this survey because there's not a place for it. So comedy and entertainment are the same thing. And Andrew Barker commented on Facebook that arts is absent here as well. You know, how do we back that if that's not in the actual terms of the survey? And the general feedback section, higher proportions fed back on programme content, original versus repeats and impartiality. Not so many people fed back on things like accuracy, misinformation, diversity. It seems that actually some people wanted the BBC more diverse and some wanted it less diverse. Welcome to 2025. Oh, and the last respondent asked for, what's this, a 10-part primetime series on the history of broadcasting presented by Paul Carenza. Yeah, that was just my addition. Anyway, you can try. If you want to put feedback on their survey, you can. We might put it on the podcast. So email me, paul@paulcarenza.com. Maybe we'll include your thoughts in a future episode here. Anyway, I've just stepped out of Cafe Nero to record this. Back inside to finish the edit, which is why the next words are from me a week ago. Saying... Before we go this time, clue number 2 for your Christmas audio treat. Clue number 1 was last episode. Clue number 3 will be next. That's how time works. But clue number 2, truth be told, you've already had clue number 2. Confusing, isn't it? Next one, next time. And something lovely comes along for your ears this Christmas of 2025. Next time on the podcast, it's episode 107. As the BBC moves to its first anniversary, it has its first armistice to face. Does it broadcast the Great Silence, and if so, how? Professor Rachel Cowgill, Professor of Music at the University of York, knows all about it. And soon you will too, here on
The British Broadcasting Century, a solo-operated podcast presented and produced by Paul Carenza. Original music is by Will Farmer, and thanks to Professor Seán Street, Emeritus Professor of Radio at Bournemouth University, for his marvellous research on 6BM Bournemouth this episode. Thanks too to James Cridland, the radio futurologist, and thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Do join them, patreon.com/Paul Carenza, to help keep this afloat, and or find us on social media. Search for BB Century or Paul Carenza on your social medium of choice. A reminder too, this is an independent podcast and not made with today's BBC at all. We're talking about the old British Broadcasting Company, not the corporation. Very different thing. Similar initials, did you notice?
So join us for episode 107 on the British Broadcasting Century.